The heavy plastic phone receiver clicked back into its cradle. The nurse wouldn't meet my eyes. She said she's busy. She murmured, "My only daughter." I lay suffocating on a sweat-stained hospital mattress, and she had an appointment. That was the exact moment I stopped being a father. Concrete feels different when it's rushing up to meet your face. I remember the smell of vulcanized rubber and fertilizer in aisle 4 of Miller's Hardware. I had gone in for a simple brass fitting. Next thing I knew, a rusty iron vise clamped around my chest, squeezing the breath out of my lungs with a violent, mechanical indifference. I didn't see a white light. I didn't see my late wife smiling at me from beyond the veil. I just saw the scuffed linoleum floor, a spilled box of galvanized screws, and the terrified face of a teenage cashier before the edges of my vision bled into black. Waking up was not a relief. It was an assault. Fluorescent lights buzzed above me like a trapped wasp. The air in the hospital room was thick, smelling heavily of industrial bleach, trying and failing to mask the sour tang of vomit and old sweat. My mouth was dry, coated in a film that tasted like I'd been chewing on aluminum foil. A rhythmic, electronic beep echoed in my right ear, keeping time with the dull, throbbing ache radiating down my left arm. I blinked against the harsh glare. A nurse was standing by the window. Her name tag read Brenda. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped beneath her faded blue scrubs, smelling faintly of stale coffee and peppermint gum. She held the room's plastic landline receiver to her ear. "Yes, ma'am," Brenda was saying, her voice a low, careful murmur. "I understand you're at work, but your father suffered a severe myocardial infarction, a heart attack. He was unconscious when the ambulance brought him in. We need next of kin to—" Brenda paused. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the tinny, compressed voice leaking from the earpiece. It was Madison, my daughter. "Look, I am literally in the middle of a vendor launch right now." Madison's voice scratched through the cheap plastic speaker. "I can't just drop everything because he forgot to take his cholesterol pills." "Is he dead?" "No, he's stable, but—" "Then the hospital can handle it," Madison interrupted. The annoyance in her tone wasn't veiled. It was naked, sharp, and deeply familiar. "I'm busy. Call his insurance. I'll text him later." Click. Brenda slowly pulled the receiver away from her ear. She stared at it for a long second before placing it gently back on the cradle. When she turned around, she saw my eyes were open. She froze. The pity that washed over her face was worse than the heart attack. Pity is a heavy, suffocating blanket. It strips you of your dignity faster than a hospital gown. "Mr. Harrison," she said softly, "you're awake." I heard. I rasped. My voice sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. Brenda didn't try to lie to me. She didn't offer a platitude about bad reception or misunderstandings. She just walked over, adjusted my IV drip, and offered me a small plastic cup of water. Her silence was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in years. I stared at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling. I didn't cry. My tear ducts felt like cracked, dry mud. Instead, a hollow, sickening drop opened up in my gut. For 32 years, I had poured every ounce of my sweat, my income, and my soul into Madison. I paid for her private schooling when my own shoes had holes in the soles. I covered the lavish wedding to Greg, a man with expensive tastes and a startling lack of ambition. I fronted the down payment on their chic downtown townhouse. I had spent decades telling myself she was just driven, just ambitious. I made excuses for the missed Father's Days, the unanswered texts, the holidays where she only showed up long enough to secure a check. I enabled her. I bought her affection because I was terrified of losing her after her mother died. But laying there, hooked up to monitors, my chest shaved and bruised, the truth was an ugly, inescapable thing. I wasn't a father to her. I was a safety net. I was an ATM. And right now, the ATM was broken, and she was too busy to kick it. My chest ached, a deep, bruised throb that had nothing to do with the clogged artery they had just propped open with a stent. I closed my eyes. The monitor kept beeping, a steady, rhythmic proof that I was still alive. I didn't feel heroic. I didn't feel a sudden surge of righteous vengeance. I just felt profoundly, embarrassingly foolish. And then, slowly, the humiliation began to curdle into something else. Something cold. Something hard. They discharged me 3 days later. Madison hadn't visited. She sent one text. Heard you are okay. Crazy week. Let's do lunch next month. I took a cab home. The taxi smelled of aggressively pine-scented air freshener, struggling to overpower decades of ingrained cigarette smoke. Every bump in the road sent a jolt of pain through my ribs. The driver didn't speak to me, which suited me fine. I just watched the city roll by through the smudged glass, feeling completely detached from it all, like a ghost haunting my own life. My house was exactly as I had left it, empty. Dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon sunlight streaming through the living room blinds. The silence was absolute, heavy enough to ring in my ears. I shuffled to my worn leather recliner, the one Madison always told me to throw out because it was an eyesore, and sat down. The vinyl squeaked, a comforting, familiar sound. I pulled out my phone. The battery was at 20%. I opened my messages. Beneath Madison's single, half-hearted text about lunch, there were 2 automated alerts from my bank. Declined. Autopay $850 to Capital Auto Finance. Declined. Autopay $3,200 to Vista Property Management. My bank had flagged the massive, out-of-state ambulance and emergency room pre-authorizations as potential fraud and temporarily frozen my main checking account. Because of that, the auto drafts I had set up for Madison's Audi lease and her portion of the townhouse HOA had bounced. The phone vibrated in my palm. A new text from Madison. Dad, did you change your debit card? The Audi payment bounced. Greg is freaking out about his credit score. Fix it ASAP, please. No, how is your heart? No. Are you in pain? Just fix it. My hands trembled. Part of it was the beta blockers messing with my circulation, but part of it was a quiet, pathetic rage. The habit of 30 years screamed at me to log into the banking app, clear the fraud alert, transfer funds from my savings, and text her an apology for the inconvenience. I was conditioned to appease her. My fingers literally hovered over the bank icon. Then I tasted the aluminum foil from the hospital again. I heard the tinny, annoyed voice. I'm busy. I dropped the phone onto the coffee table. It landed with a dull clack. I forced myself up from the chair. My legs felt like wet sand. I walked into the kitchen and opened my laptop on the island counter. The screen glared, stinging my tired eyes. I logged into the joint credit card account I kept for emergencies. I had given her a card 10 years ago for gas and groceries. Over time, the definition of an emergency had stretched. I pulled up the statement for the day of my heart attack, Tuesday, the 12th. At 1:14 p.m., my heart stopped beating in a hardware store. At 1:30 p.m., the paramedics shocked me back to life in an ambulance. At 2:15 p.m., Brenda the nurse made her phone call. I scrolled down to the transactions for Tuesday the 12th. 2:45 p.m., Laura Fine Dining, $412.50. 4:30 p.m., the spa at the Grand, $280. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. She wasn't in the middle of a vendor launch. She wasn't swamped at work. She had taken a long lunch at a Michelin star restaurant and followed it up with a massage while my chest was cut open, while a surgeon threaded a catheter through my groin to my heart. My stomach heaved. I leaned over the kitchen sink, gripping the stainless steel edge so hard my knuckles went white. I dry heaved, a painful, violent spasm that pulled at my chest incision. Nothing came up. I turned on the cold water, splashed it over my face, and stared at my reflection in the window pane. I looked old, gray skin, dark bags under my eyes, thinning hair, a spent battery. I grabbed a dish towel, dried my face, and walked back to the laptop. The contradiction in my chest was maddening. A father's instinct is to protect. But what do you do when the thing you need to protect yourself from is your own child? I clicked on the Account Management tab. There was a button labeled Remove Authorized User. I stared at it. It was such a small button, just a few pixels on a screen. But clicking it meant crossing a line I could never uncross. It meant admitting out loud that I had failed as a parent. It meant severing the only tie that kept her tethered to me, even if it was a toxic, parasitic tie. I clicked it. A pop-up asked, "Are you sure you want to revoke access for Madison Harrison Gregson?" "Yes," I whispered to the empty kitchen. I clicked confirm. The screen refreshed. Her name vanished, just like that. The safety net was gone. The next morning, I woke up with a singular, clarifying focus. The physical exhaustion was still there. My body felt like it was made of lead and bruised fruit, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. The fog of perpetual parental guilt had lifted. I didn't do this with a manic grin. I didn't plot my revenge like a villain in a movie. I did it with the methodical, tired efficiency of a contractor tearing down a house built on a rotten foundation. First, I went to the bank in person. Driving was out of the question, so I took the city bus. The smell of diesel exhaust and damp wool coats clung to the air. The rattling window vibrated against my skull, exacerbating my headache. The bank manager was a kid named Leo. He wore too much hair gel and a suit that was half a size too tight. He looked annoyed when I sat down at his cubicle, until I handed him my ID and my platinum debit card. "I need to close my primary checking and savings accounts," I said, my voice steady, "and I need to open new ones. In my name only, no joint access. No linked external accounts." Leo clicked his mouse a few times, his eyebrows rising. "Mr. Harrison, you have several auto drafts tied to this routing number. Mortgages, car leases, utility bills for a property on Elm Street. Cancel them all. They will bounce, sir. It could affect your credit." "I own my home outright, Leo. My truck is paid off, and my credit score is going to die with me anyway. Close it." It took 45 minutes. When he stamped the final paperwork, the loud, solid thwack of rubber on paper sounded like a gavel dropping. Next was the phone company. A simple phone call from the bank lobby. I was the primary account holder for a family plan that included unlimited premium data, international roaming, and device insurance for Madison and Greg's top-of-the-line smartphones. "I need to remove 2 lines from this account," I told the customer service rep. "Sir, those phones are still under a financing agreement. If you cancel the lines, the remaining balance for the devices will become due immediately." "Charge it to my new card," I said, reading off the numbers Leo had just given me. It cost me $2,000 to buy out their phones, a small price for silence, and turn the service off immediately. Don't wait for the end of the billing cycle. By the time I left the bank, it was noon. My chest was throbbing. I needed to go home and rest. I needed to take my medication. But there was one last piece of business, the most petty and the most necessary. The Audi. I had co-signed the lease, but technically, because Greg had terrible credit and Madison had no verifiable income outside of her influencer sponsorships, the title and lease agreement were entirely in my name. I was just letting her drive it. I took another bus across town toward the upscale downtown district. The transition from my modest, working-class neighborhood to her manicured, tree-lined street was jarring. Everything here smelled like money and freshly cut grass. I walked 2 blocks from the bus stop to her townhouse. My breath was coming short. I had to stop and lean against a wrought iron fence to let a wave of dizziness pass. Sweat beaded on my forehead, cold and clammy. When I turned the corner, I saw it. The pristine white Audi SUV parked on the street. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the spare key fob I had kept for the last 2 years. I pressed the unlock button. The headlights flashed. I opened the door and climbed into the driver's seat. The interior smelled intensely of Madison expensive vanilla perfume, a hint of dry shampoo, and leather conditioner. The back seat was littered with shopping bags from high-end boutiques. There was a half-empty iced coffee in the cup holder, the condensation pooling at the bottom. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. I could just leave. I could just go home, let the accounts bounce, and ignore her calls. Stealing the car felt vindictive. It felt mean. "I'm busy." I pushed the ignition button. The engine purred to life. I didn't drive it far, just across town to a secure, long-term parking garage near the airport. I parked it on the top floor, out of sight. I locked the doors, pocketed the key, and walked away. I finally made it back to my own house around 4 in the afternoon. I was trembling with exhaustion. I managed to swallow my pills with a glass of tap water before collapsing into the vinyl recliner. The house was silent again. But this time, it didn't feel oppressive. It felt like a blank slate. At 4:15 p.m., my cell phone lit up. It wasn't a call from Madison. It was a text. "Dad, my phone says no service. I'm using Greg's hotspot. Also, the Wi-Fi at the house is down. Did you forget to pay the bill again?" I didn't reply. At 4:30 p.m., the screen lit up again. "Dad, where is my car? Did you send someone to tow it? Greg is calling the police." I watched the screen glow in the dimming light of the living room. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel a sick thrill of victory. I just felt profoundly, overwhelmingly tired. But for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't carrying her weight. I turned the phone on silent, placed it face down on the table, and finally closed my eyes to rest. Dust settled on the glass surface of the coffee table. I watched the particles drift through a slant of afternoon sunlight, moving with a slow, random grace. My phone had been vibrating against the wood for 3 days. The screen was a chaotic mosaic of missed calls, voicemails, and furious text messages. First came the confusion. "Dad, why is the Wi-Fi off? Dad, why is the leasing office calling me about the rent?" Then came the panic. "Where is the car? Did you get hacked? The bank said you closed the accounts. Call me back now." Finally, the vitriol. "You are ruining my life. Greg's credit is taking a hit. You're acting like a child. Pick up the damn phone." I didn't pick up. I didn't listen to the voicemails. I just sat in my vinyl recliner, drinking tepid tap water, feeling the ache in my chest slowly mutate from a sharp, medical agony into a dull, lingering bruise. The beta blockers made my extremities cold. My toes felt like ice inside my wool socks. Every time I inhaled too deeply, the incision site near my groin where the catheter had gone in pulled and burned. It was a physical reminder of my mortality, a sharp little pinch to keep me grounded. It happened on a Thursday evening. The sky outside had bruised into a deep, violent purple, and it was raining. A hard, cold, driving rain that lashed against the vinyl siding of my small house. The doorbell didn't just ring, it was assaulted. 3 long, aggressive bursts that rattled the cheap plastic casing in the hallway. This was followed by the heavy, meaty sound of a fist pounding on the wood. "Dad, open the door. I know you're in there." Madison's voice. Shrill, demanding, completely devoid of the panic one might expect from a daughter whose father had just survived a major cardiac event. I pushed myself up from the recliner. My knees popped, my breath hitched, a shallow gasp that tasted of stale coffee. I walked down the narrow hallway, the floorboards groaning under my slippers. I didn't rush, let them wait in the rain. I unlocked the deadbolt. The heavy clack echoed in the quiet house. I turned the brass knob and pulled the door open. A wall of damp, humid air hit me, smelling of wet asphalt and expensive cologne. Greg stood on the porch, his shoulders hunched against the rain, a scowl pulling down the corners of his mouth. He was wearing a designer trench coat that looked absurd on a man who hadn't worked a full-time job in 4 years. Next to him was Madison. Her hair, usually blown out into immaculate waves, was plastered to her forehead. Her makeup was immaculate, though. She hadn't been crying. She was just angry. "What the hell is going on?" Madison snapped. She pushed past me without an invitation, bringing the smell of damp wool and her cloying vanilla perfume into my foyer. Greg followed, stepping heavily onto the hardwood floor without wiping his expensive leather loafers. I closed the door. The sound of the rain was muffled, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the hallway. "Hello, Madison," I said. My voice was raspy. I hadn't spoken out loud in 3 days. "Hello, Greg." "Don't." "Hello, Madison me." She spun around, her finger pointing at my chest. "Do you have any idea what kind of week I've had? My car is gone. Stolen. The police laughed at me because my name isn't on the title. My phone got shut off in the middle of a sponsored live stream, and the HOA sent a warning letter to our door. Have you lost your mind? I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the faint lines forming around her mouth, the sharp, defensive set of her jaw. I tried to find the little girl who used to beg me to carry her on my shoulders at the county fair. I tried to find the teenager who cried on my shoulder when she didn't make the cheer squad. She wasn't there. The person standing in my hallway was a stranger, a hostile tenant I had been subsidizing for entirely too long. I haven't lost my mind, I said, leaning my weight against the wall. The exhaustion was a heavy blanket over my shoulders. I just closed some accounts. Greg stepped forward, trying to use his height to intimidate me. He was 6'2", broad-shouldered, carrying the misplaced confidence of a man who lived exclusively on someone else's dime. You can't just do that, Frank. You co-signed the lease. You committed to the HOA fees. You're breaching a contract. I signed the lease. Yes, I replied, staring at the wet footprints he was leaving on my floor, which means I'm the primary. And I decided I no longer want to finance your lifestyle, Greg. As for the HOA, that was a courtesy, a gift. Gifts can stop. Madison let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. A gift? Dad, you promised to help us out until my brand took off. You promised. What is wrong with you? Is this because of your little hospital trip? Are you throwing a tantrum because I couldn't visit you? Little hospital trip. The words hung in the air, acidic and foul. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The monitor beep from the ICU echoed in my memory. I'm busy. I died, Madison, I said quietly. She blinked. The anger faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. You didn't die. You had a minor heart attack. You're standing right here. My heart stopped in aisle 4 of a hardware store. I corrected her, keeping my tone perfectly flat. A paramedic cracked 2 of my ribs doing chest compressions. They shocked me back. I was unconscious. The hospital called you, my only living relative, to tell you I might not make it through the night, and you told them you were busy. I was at work, she yelled, her face flushing red. You were at a spa, I said. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the drumming of the rain against the roof. Madison's mouth opened slightly. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving the bronzer looking unnatural and harsh against her pale skin. She glanced at Greg, then back to me. You checked my credit card statement, she whispered, her voice dropping an octave. The indignation was returning, masking her guilt. You violated my privacy. It was my credit card, I reminded her. My name, my money. I checked the statement to see if maybe, just maybe, you actually were overwhelmed with your career. But you were getting a hot stone massage while a surgeon was snaking a tube into my heart. Dad, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. I understand perfectly, I interrupted. I pushed myself off the wall. The sudden movement sent a spike of pain through my sternum, but I ignored it. I understand that I raised a woman who views me exclusively as a walking wallet. I understand that I spent 30 years enabling you, terrifying myself with the thought that if I stopped paying, you would stop visiting. Well, the joke is on me. You stopped visiting anyway. This is ridiculous, Greg scoffed, crossing his arms. You're being dramatic. If you wanted us to pay the phone bill, just say so. Don't steal the car and cut off the accounts like a psycho. I turned my gaze to Greg. I felt a sudden, profound disgust. Not just for him, but for myself for tolerating him. The car is parked at the airport, long-term garage. The key is in the mail. I mailed it to the leasing company, along with a check to cover the penalty for early termination. I surrendered the vehicle. Madison gasped, taking a step back. You gave back my car? How am I supposed to get to meetings? Take the bus, I said, or buy a car. You're 32 years old. I can't afford a car payment right now. Greg is between jobs. Then Greg should get a job, I said. It was a simple statement, but to them, it sounded like a declaration of war. Madison's eyes narrowed. The panic was gone entirely now, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. This was the manipulation tactic she always used when she didn't get her way. She was going for the emotional jugular. "Mom would be ashamed of you," she hissed. The words hit me like a physical blow. A dull thud right in the center of my chest, exactly where the surgeon had been working. For a second, the hallway tilted. I saw my late wife's face, her soft smile, the way she used to brush Madison's hair before bed. Madison knew exactly what she was doing. She was using a ghost to fight her battles. 10 years ago, that sentence would have broken me. I would have folded, apologized, and written a check to make the tension go away. But I was too tired. The foil taste was back in my mouth. I looked at my daughter. The hostility in her eyes was toxic. I didn't feel rage anymore. I just felt a deep, hollow pity. "Your mother," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "would be horrified by the woman you've become. She raised a daughter, not a parasite." Madison flinched, as if I had slapped her. Her mouth worked silently for a moment. She looked around the hallway, searching for something to break, something to throw. When she found nothing, she grabbed Greg's arm. "We're leaving," she spat. "If you want to act like a bitter, lonely old man, fine. Die alone. Don't expect a phone call from me. Don't expect me to come to your funeral." She yanked the front door open. The rain was coming down harder now, a chaotic sheet of gray water. "I wouldn't dream of it," I said to her back. "You'd probably be busy." She slammed the door. The sound echoed through the empty house, vibrating against the floorboards, rattling the cheap plastic doorbell casing one last time. I stood in the hallway for a long time. I listened to the sound of Greg's heavy loafers splashing through the puddles on the walkway. I listened to the distant roar of a car engine starting, probably an Uber they had to call. I waited for the tears to come. I waited for the crushing weight of grief and regret to buckle my knees. I waited to feel the loss of my only child. But all I felt was a strange, terrifying lightness. The air in the house suddenly smelled less like damp wool and expensive perfume, and more like rain and old pine wood. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a fresh glass of water, and took my evening medication. I was alone, completely and entirely alone, and for the first time in my life, I was okay with it. Healing is not a linear process. It is a stubborn, ugly, deeply unglamorous chore. The autumn crept in slowly, turning the leaves on the oak tree in my front yard a brittle, burnt orange. The mornings grew sharp and cold. My life shrank down to a very small, very manageable routine. 3 days a week, I took the bus to the hospital for cardiac rehabilitation. The rehab center was in the basement of the East Wing. It smelled of industrial-strength floor cleaner, warm rubber treadmills, and the sour sweat of terrified, fragile people. We were a pathetic bunch, really. A dozen old men and women in oversized sweatpants, hooked up to portable telemetry monitors, walking slowly on treadmills, while nurses watched our heart rates on a central screen. There was no glory in it. Every step was a negotiation with my own mortality. My chest still ached. The incision scar was an ugly, raised purple ridge that itched constantly. But I showed up. A nurse named Pam ran the morning sessions. She was a no-nonsense woman with thick forearms and a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the cinder block walls. She didn't coddle us. "Pick up the pace, Henry," she barked at me one Tuesday morning. "You're walking, not browsing a museum. Get that heart rate up to 1 to 10. I grunted, increasing the speed on the treadmill. My thighs burned. Sweat dripped into my eyes, stinging sharply. I grabbed the coarse towel draped over the console and wiped my face. "Doing good." A voice wheezed next to me. It was an older man named Arthur. Wait, no, I can't use that name. An older man named William. He had survived a quadruple bypass. His skin was paper thin and bruised yellow from blood thinners. "Feels like I'm walking underwater," I muttered, keeping my eyes on the digital numbers ticking away on the screen. "It gets better," William said, his sneakers squeaking rhythmically on the belt. "Or you get used to it." Either way, you're still walking. He was right. I was still walking. The silence from Madison was absolute. At first, I expected an ambush. I expected a lawyer's letter demanding money, or a sudden tearful appearance on my porch playing the victim. But nothing came. I learned, through the grapevine of a mutual family friend, that the townhouse had gone into foreclosure. Greg had finally been forced to take a job managing a mid-tier retail store at the mall. Madison had moved out, renting a cramped apartment across town, complaining loudly on her social media channels about toxic family members who had betrayed her. I didn't seek out the information. It just drifted to me, like trash blowing across a lawn. I felt a twinge of guilt when I heard about the foreclosure, a conditioned reflex from decades of fixing her messes. But I let the feeling wash over me and fade away. I didn't reach for my checkbook. I didn't pick up the phone. My bank account, freed from the parasitic drain of car leases, luxury groceries, and HOA fees, began to recover. For the first time in 10 years, I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck. I bought decent coffee. I hired a local kid to fix the rattling gutters on the roof. I bought a new, firm mattress that didn't aggravate my ribs. The money didn't bring me joy, but the absence of financial panic brought me a profound, boring peace. It was a Tuesday in late November when the final thread snapped. I was sitting at the kitchen island. The house smelled of roasting chicken and rosemary. I was reading a paperback novel, something I hadn't done since my wife was alive. The rain was tapping a gentle, chaotic rhythm against the window glass. My phone vibrated on the counter. An unknown number. Normally, I let them go to voicemail, but I was expecting a call from the roofing contractor about an estimate for the garage. I swiped the screen and lifted it to my ear. "Hello, Dad." The voice was small, trembling. All the sharp, arrogant edges had been sanded down. It was Madison. My heart, the damaged, scarred muscle in my chest, skipped a beat, a physiological reaction I couldn't control. I closed my eyes, listening to the static on the line. "Madison," I said evenly. I need help," she whispered. Her voice cracked. I could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background. Greg left. He packed his stuff while I was at work and just left. "My rent is past due. They put a notice on my door. I don't have anywhere to go, Dad. I don't have anyone." The silence stretched between us. The roasting chicken smelled savory and rich. The rain tapped against the glass. 30 years of programming screamed at me. Save her. Fix it. Pay the rent. Bring her home. My hand gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. I felt the rough grain of the wood under my fingertips. I felt the dull ache in my chest. I thought about the hospital bed, the smell of bleach, the plastic landline receiver in Brenda, the nurse's hand. "I'm busy." I didn't feel vindictive. I didn't want to punish her. I just realized, with a cold, absolute clarity, that if I saved her now, she would never survive. She would just attach herself to me again, feeding off my resources, hating me for it, until the day I actually died. True help, the only help I had left to give her, was the hardest thing a parent could ever do. "I'm sorry, Madison," I said. My voice was steady, but my throat tightened. "I can't." "Dad, please," she sobbed. It was a real sob, raw and terrified. "I'm scared. I don't know what to do." "You're 32, I told her, looking out the window at the dying oak tree. "You're smart. You will figure it out. You have to. You can't do this. You're my father." "I was your bank," I corrected gently. "The bank is closed. Goodbye, Madison." "Dad, don't." I pulled the phone away from my ear. My thumb hovered over the red button. My hand shook violently. A single tear, hot and stinging, broke free and rolled down my cheek, catching in the stubble on my jaw. I pressed the button. The call ended. I blocked the number. I set the phone face down on the counter. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the silence of the house. It was a heavy silence, thick with grief. I mourned the daughter I never really had. I mourned the decades I spent trying to buy her love. I mourned the little girl with the scraped knees who used to look at me like I hung the moon. But as the minutes ticked by, the heaviness began to lift. I walked over to the oven, checked the temperature on the chicken. I poured myself a glass of cheap grocery store red wine. I walked into the living room and sat in my squeaky vinyl recliner. I looked at the empty room. No designer bags thrown on the sofa. No passive-aggressive comments about my furniture. No looming threat of an overdrawn checking account. My chest hurt. My ribs ached. My heart was a patched-up engine running on beta blockers in spite. But it was beating. It was beating for me. I took a sip of the wine. It tasted tart and dry. I watched the rain slide down the window pane, blurring the streetlights into soft glowing orbs. I was alone. I was tired. But I was finally, truly, awake. If you felt the raw reality of this story, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Family dynamics aren't always perfect, and sometimes the hardest boundary to set is the most necessary one. What would you have done in his shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deeply grounded human storytelling every single week. See you in the next video.